This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Kamat. Our guest for this hour is Allan Nairn, award-winning journalist and activist. Allan, I want to get your response to President Obama's invocation of the concept of a just war. This in his speech accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in December.
Right. Well, we must begin by acknowledging a hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago. Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. As someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life work, I am living testimony to the moral force of nonviolence. I know there's nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King. But as a head of state, sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. A nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Negotiations cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms.
An excerpt of President Obama's Nobel acceptance speech in Oslo just about a month ago. Allan Nairn, your response?
Well, he's right. There is evil in the world, and Obama should stop committing it. He should stop doing bombing raids that kill civilians. He should stop backing forces that kill civilians. It's probably true that nonviolence couldn't have stopped Hitler. There are just resorts to violence. If you're standing there with your mother, someone comes in with a machine gun, you step in front. And if you've got a gun, you try to kill the machine gunner before they blow away you and your mother. Sure, there are lots of situations like that in life. But that's not the situation of the U.S. in foreign policy. As Obama was making that speech, he was saying, when we resort to violence, we will abide by the rules. This was exactly at the moment when the U.S. was blocking the UN from doing precisely that. The Goldstone report had recommended, in just one example, that Israel be brought to the International Criminal Court for their assault on Gaza, and that, as well as Hamas, and that let the chips fall where they may, do an objective investigation, see if rules of law were violated, see if crimes against humanity were committed, as he said they were, and Obama blocked it. The U.S. Itself, in its operations in dozens upon dozens of countries, is violating not just international law, but U.S. law. People have forgotten about them because they're not enforced. Here are 4 U.S. laws currently on the books. There can be no U.S. weapons used for aggression. That's the old Harkin Amendment. There can be no U.S. aid for foreign internal security forces of any kind. That's Section 660 of the 1974 Foreign Assistance Act. There can be no U.S. military aid for any regime that engages in a pattern of gross human rights violations. That's 22 U.S. Code 2304A. There can be no U.S. aid from any military unit that commits atrocities. That's the Leahy Amendment. Now, these are not radical political demands. These are existing U.S. law. And the U.S. systematically violates its own laws, not to mention the murder laws of local countries.
Where? Name the countries.
Well, just to, we mentioned before some of the places where the U.S. is bombing and attacking. Less known. These are some examples of the machine being and kill. Repressive, what in Rand's words, Rand Corporation's words, repressive regimes being backed by the U.S. Algeria, where they annulled an election, they stole an election, they do systematic torture. Ethiopia, where there's mass hunger among the population, but where the U.S. is building up the Ethiopian army and using them against Somalia. Saudi Arabia, the most religious extremist, anti-woman dictatorship in the world. Jordan, a torture center. The Jordanian intelligence outfit was, in the words of George Tenet, owned by the CIA, and both the CIA and Israel use it for torture. Rwanda, whose army and paramilitaries have been pillaging and raping and massively killing in the eastern Congo. Congo itself. Secretary of State Clinton went there and made a good denunciation of rape by the Congolese army. And as that was happening, the U.S. was delivering weapons and training to that same Congolese army. Indonesia, where the army now de facto occupies and terrorizes Papua and has recently resumed assassinations in Aceh, the other end of the archipelago. Colombia, where army and army-backed paramilitaries are the world's #1 killer of labor activists. Uzbekistan, a massive torturer, backed simultaneously by the U.S. and Russia. Thailand, where U.S. officers who I spoke to use their U.S. training in what they call target selection to assassinate and disappear Muslim rebels in the south. Nepal, where U.S. Green Berets for years created old Guatemala-style civil patrols that carried out lynchings against pro-Maoist forces, civilians in the countryside. India, where the police do daily torture, and where their own officers talk about using terror against villages in the Naxalite rebel areas. Egypt, one of the world's leading torture states and Israel's accomplice in the blockade and hungering of Gaza. Honduras, where the army recently staged a coup when the oligarchy's president, Zelaya, turned against his fellow oligarchs. Israel, which committed aggression against Gaza using U.S. white phosphorus and cluster bombs, as the U.S. was the U.S. was shipping in new material as this attack was underway, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, whereas the British Guardian just reported the security forces are doing systematic torture of Hamas people and other dissidents under CIA sponsorship. And that's only a partial list. We'd need another 20-minute segment to complete the list. But in not one of these cases has Obama decided to comply with U.S. law, comply with international law, and cut off the killer forces. In fact, in a number of them, he's stepped it up. In Indonesia, for example, he's made a push to renew aid to the Kopassus, the Red Berets, the most deadly of the killer forces, hated by the people, long trained by the U.S. Green Berets.
You made a provocative statement at the beginning of this broadcast comparing an Obama presidency with a possible Palin presidency, and whether you would see a difference when it comes to foreign policy.
Right. Well, in terms of killing civilians overseas, no difference. Every single action I've laid out could easily be adopted by Palin. In fact, Obama is carrying them out using Bush's Secretary of Defense, Gates, using Bush's old counterterrorism man, Brennan, using Admiral Dennis Blair, who personally, this is something that we discussed in an earlier show in which I personally reported on, who green-lighted church massacres of Catholic churches by General Wiranto in occupied East Timor in 1999 to punish the Timorese for voting for independence. So